Delighted to have Jonathan Davis. Jonathan, you're an economist and podcaster. I must mention Booms and Bust, I believe, is your show. Good evening to you.
Hi, Daisy.
How are you?
I'm all right, thanks.
Very good. What did you make of the Chancellor? Did he have due cause to be tiggerish?
Well, of course, it's a party political broadcast, a spring statement or a budget. I mean, that's what they're designed for, ultimately. They pretend it's about managing the economy. No, it's to tell the world or tell the British public that they're brilliant and they should re-elect them. So, mildly he should be content because, of course, there's no major shocks going on right now. But the UK economy is really controlled, if that's the right word, or affected by the global economy. We're not I was going to say we're not an island. in a sense we are, of course.
An economic island.
But it's the global economy that determines the UK economy, so long as governments are not massively getting involved. If they could stay the heck out more than they do, then we'd certainly be doing a great deal better than we are.
And the global economy, certainly I think the top 6 economies in the world at the moment are, for the first time in more than a decade, all doing rather well. So ergo, we should be doing well too.
And that's exactly the point. If anything, we should be mildly concerned that you just said it. In more than a decade, it was 2008, we had the last recession. It was a global recession. And the fact is, these things come around roughly every 10 years or so. The one before that was the early 2000s. So I'm not saying we're going to have one this year or even next year, but the fact is, we do have a recession roughly every 10 years. But certainly between now and the next 2 or 3 years, and that's really the kind of timescale that politicians think about, yes, from his point of view, as a politician, that's his career, he should be tiggerish. For the rest of the country, no, we're only looking at about 1.5% per annum growth, which is essentially what we've had for the last several years. And, as John Maynard Keynes, famous economist in the mid-20th century, said, a depression, an economic depression, is an extended period of slow or no growth. And you know what, Daisy? That's what we've had since 2009.
But then on the other hand,
believe it or not, an economic depression.
Then on the other hand, and I hate to use the expression "despite Brexit," but that is what we keep saying, isn't it? Despite Brexit, this is considerably better than a lot of the doom mongers said that we would, the situation we'd be in at this stage.
And those doom mongers were the establishment. They were the likes of Philip Hammond, the Chancellor. They were the then Prime Minister, the then Chancellor, the CBI, the directors, the IMF, the Bank of England. It was the establishment who said that if we vote for Brexit, not even Brexit, just vote for Brexit, that we would go to hell in a handcart. Well,
and yet you have just said that we are doing worse than other countries. So is that because of Brexit, despite Brexit?
That's nothing to do with Brexit. That's because of the policies that our government and the Bank of England have pursued. For example, the Mark Carney, he has kept interest rates too low and for too long. Thus, our currency has been lower than perhaps it could have been. Thus, our import costs have been more than they should have been, and let's face it, we import practically everything. Therefore, our cost of living has been higher than it should have been. And then on the other side, on incomes, the fact that we've only had about 1.5% per annum growth for so many years, and if you look at the detail, the bulk of that has gone to the top 10%, which means the bottom 30, 40% are on like £9 an hour. Don't tell me about all-time high records in employment when it's £8 or £9 an hour. That's the reason why we've got lacklustre growth. So it's nothing to do with Brexit. It's government policies and Bank of England policies.
So how can we increase our productivity?
Well, largely by doing a reversal of what these guys have been doing for about the last 10 years. Their solution to the problem of banking catastrophe was to bail out the banks. Well, what that means is that they borrowed £1,000 billion from the next generations. Now, that therefore obviously increases the national debt, which means we pay more interest. So the reversal would be that we stop borrowing, we reduce spending, we balance the budget, and indeed Mark Carney at the Bank of England actually raises interest rates rather than cuts them. Thus, we increase the value of the pound, we reduce the cost of imports, we become more competitive. There's lots of things they can do, but they just will not do it.
But on borrowing, you mentioned that. I mean, Chancellor was at great pains today to say that, the deficit was entirely the Labour government's fault and that Corbyn's government would increase the debt again and that actually the news on debt was good.
Yeah. Well, it's better than it was, but as I say, in the point in the economic cycle, we're at a high point in the cycle. We haven't had a recession since 2008, as everyone knows. And economic cycles have up cycles, and then they have down cycles. We're at a point in the cycle where it's almost like we're in fourth gear. We're not quite in fifth gear. We're in fourth gear, and things feel good. Let me take you back to 2007. I call my podcast the Booms and Bust Show. Gordon Brown said in 2007, before he became Prime Minister, he was still Chancellor, I've ended booms and busts. What happened in 2008? My point being 2007 felt so good. Everything was running on full steam ahead. But the reality is that was the point when we should have been cautious. Instead, they went into fifth gear, they put the handbrake down, they pumped up the gas, and then bang, we went straight into a wall. I'm not saying that we're going into a wall this year or next year, but we're in fourth gear, heading towards fifth gear.
Jonathan,
we should be cautious.
Excuse me for interrupting, but I completely agree that historically there has been a boom and bust cycle, and that's just like a balloon. If you blow it up too much, it will pop, which is what happens. But normally it's been a specific industry, hasn't it? A specific area where it's happened. Are you saying? And the people are saying, well, it's got to be tech that's going to cause the next bust. Would you agree that would be the most likely area to explode and take us all down? It'll be the sort of overvalued tech companies.
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't actually. I think that's a ridiculous concept that people are saying. The tech companies are incredibly innovative, and they're creating. You asked about how do we get more productivity. Well, where would we be without our laptops, without the internet? The only thing on the horizon that I can perceive that could create a problem economically is in fact that we in America, not the UK Bank of England, but in America, they raise interest rates quicker than the markets and global finance generally expects, because clearly we've had practically a decade of, in effect, zero interest rates. The US has now raised 5 times. They're up to 1.5%. It's taken them a couple of years to get there. Note, of course, the UK hasn't raised interest rates. We're at 0.5%. We've been at 0.5% since 2009, apart from a very short period in 2016-17, but we're at 0.5%. So the US is raising rates. And if they raise too quickly, then yes, that is, clearly with a hugely indebted global society, that could have a negative effect. But I don't see them doing that too quickly. So I think 2018 and maybe even 29 should be okay. But maybe the second half of 2019, then you could have problems.
Well, of course, we all know who will be avidly following the American economy in 2019. We know about there are economic cycles and there are presidential cycles. And certainly if you look at Donald Trump at the moment, he's constantly claiming that the American economy is in rude good health and that it's all down to him, and that the American stock markets are at all-time high and that's all down to him, and so on. Do you buy that?
No, not at all. Irrespective of the fact that he's been a businessman for 40 years, he is now, for the past few years, he's a politician. So he thinks and acts like a politician. And like Philip Hammond yesterday, he's acting Tiggerish. He's showing to the world that everything's fine, everything's fine and dandy, so vote for us the next time there's a vote. Well, we should take what politicians say with a massive pinch of salt. The US is growing reasonably well, but similarly, it's about 2%. It's not at all strong, and just like the UK and indeed most of the West, the bulk of the growth is going to the top 10%. That's not because of Trump or even in spite of Trump. Similarly, in the UK, it's not because of or in spite of Brexit. It's just global central banking policies, keeping interest rates lower for longer, governments continuing to borrow. The United States are going to borrow this year $1,000 billion. It's a remarkable amount of money. Well, of course, if you borrow that amount of money, you can keep the plate spinning, but that's where, as I say, potentially interest rates could come back and bite you perhaps in the next year or two.
Jonathan, before I lose you, I must just ask you about, obviously, the much bigger economic story of the day, which is the future of the penny coin and the 2p coin, which last night seemed to be that their days were numbered. And then today we've had this massive government U-turn that, no, our 1p and 2p pieces are safe. What did you make of all of that?
Well, the phrase I use about that kind of thing, it's a massive herring rouge, a red herring. It
smells fishy.
It
smells fishy.
It's not big picture. Ultimately, the costs of living are such that pennies are ultimately irrelevant. The big picture, Daisy, is that governments globally want to get rid of cash. And that terrifies me. Unfortunately, it's probably going to happen over the next 10 or 20 years.
Well, Jonathan, I hope this hasn't terrified you. I'm delighted you could join us here on Talk Radio this evening. That was Jonathan Davis, economist and podcaster.